Hello, this is iPoSwords. You may recognize this from a video I uploaded the other week, and then quickly removed after I realized I'd made some errors. Consider this my upgraded 2.0 version of a review of this sword. On first glance, this sword appears to be a rapier, featuring the classic swept hilt with a swept ring and a thrusting blade. However, that's not actually the case. This sword dates from around 1836 till 1847. In that general period, rapiers, of course, were not commonly used. The weapon of the time was the sabre, and for officers occasionally something similar to a smallsword or spadroon. This, then, was a custom-made sword for someone who wanted to harken back to an earlier day. It features very French symbolism, with lions' heads adorning the knucklebow, the ricasso, the swept ring, and the Coulaux. The side rings are unadorned and rather large, disproportionately so compared to many swept ring rapiers, and the blade is slightly narrower and slightly thinner than you'd expect for an original rapier. However, that's not the biggest problem here. The biggest problem is proportions. This swept ring interacts with the hand when you're holding the sword, and that prevents you from being able to hold it properly, as the space between the ricasso and the swept ring is quite constrictive and impinges on the hand. I don't have particularly large hands, although perhaps I do by 19th century standards, but when holding this sword in many grips and angling the blade, I can feel the swept ring here pressing against my hand. And I think that's a space-saving concession, also evidenced by the fact that this is an asymmetrical hilt with nothing on this side, not what you'd expect with a traditional rapier. I think this was supposed to be made to be small and compact compared to a full swept ring rapier. And that hints back to the fact that this is a 19th century sword, not truly intended to be used in dueling like a traditional 16th, 17th or 18th century rapier. And that theme continues into the blade. The blade on this sword features what's called a toledo blade, with a wide central fuller flanked by two narrow fullers. The wide central fuller only extends about a third of the way up the blade before terminating, where it is promptly replaced by a thick spine that heads towards the tip, which is still flanked by the two narrow fullers. The width of the blade at the base is around 6 millimeters, and it is inscribed Coulaux et ci Klingenthal, or Coulaux & Co. Klingenthal, which dates it between 1836 and somewhere around 1962, when this marking was in use. However, the stylistic appearance of the blade, being the distinctive Toledo shape, tells me this was probably somewhere around 1840, when this was very in vogue. It has a few benefits when used on something like a saber blade, compared to the traditional Wilkinson or a pipeback blade. It allows you to maintain a fairly stiff and light blade. However, it does make it more flexible than you'd want an actual rapier to be. Many rapier were about 8 to 11 millimeters thick here at the spine, and featured diamond cross-section blades, often slightly flattened, or even other more complex shapes, like flattened ovoid cross-sections. This imparted extreme stiffness to the blade, whereas this is slightly flexible. Another hint that this is not a traditional rapier from the 16th, 17th, or 18th century is the wire wrapping on this grip. You'll note that the wire is a fairly thick gauge and is merely twisted around itself, not plaited. There are also no Turk's head knots, opting instead for flat steel ferrules. This would not be traditional in a rapier of the 16th, 17th, or 18th century, unless you looked at some budget Spanish tarza from the late 18th century, which may have used steel ferrules. But for the most part, Turk's head knots were much more common at the time. The hollow pommel and slightly lightened and shortened blade, this blade is only around 80 centimeters long, leads to a balance just before the finger rings, which makes it a very handleable sword if you chose to do so. However, I maintain that this mainly intended to live on a wall. It's a fairly nice sword and is very well made. The hollow pommel is exceptionally well crafted, and the rivets are completely blind from the reverse side. It's only developed some light patination over the past 150 odd years, and is in overall very good condition. The nickel-coated blade shines as an example of the benefits of nickel-coated blades. It is completely unblemished by the time. I do have one issue with this blade, and that's the fact it's been set very far into the hilt, meaning the inspector's marks cannot be seen, and I can't identify who the supervisor and inspector were when this sword was made, which would allow me to date it slightly more accurately. The hilt is peened, and the blade is around 6 to 6.5 millimeters in thickness through the tang, so it would be a completely functional sword if you chose to use it that way. You'll also note that while the blade is nickel coated and the edges are slightly blunted due to that thickened nickel coating, it does have a completely functional blade. While it is slightly more flexible than a traditional rapier, it is still fairly stiff, and the point is definitely acute and able to puncture. I am by no means an expert rapierist. However, I would have to concede that this is not an ideal weapon. The lack of space between the swept ring and the ricasso, the constricting feeling across the swept ring, the oversized front finger rings, and the short blade have significant disadvantages if you were to use this in a duel or fencing. However, if you were to simply wear this for decorative purposes or hang it on a wall, it is completely sufficient. In fact, the smaller scale of the hilt, especially in this dimension, would make it much more convenient to wear at your side, as you'd be less likely to bump into it with your arm. On the topic of wearing it at your side, there's something else about this sword which is not truly traditional. This is the scabbard that came with this sword from the factory back in 1836 to 1847. You'll note that it has an L-shaped hook here, which is essentially a teardrop on a nail. And this is a traditional way of hanging a small sword scabbard rather than a rapier. Rapiers would have used complex suspension mechanisms, often involving a D-shaped loop of leather here with straps coming up which would connect to a belt. This is obviously a very different arrangement, and that's both a cost concession, a time concession, and a stylistic concession. There's actually a specific metal hanger and suspension system for this type of scabbard. However, I don't have one on me at the moment. I'll feature that in another video in the future. I'd also like to note that this is not the normal way a rapier scabbard is constructed, as this is simply compressed leather. One downside of that is that they're very prone to breakages, as you can see here. Once upon a time, this was the chape for this scabbard, and you can see that it broke there. This actually happened during transit, and I'm certain of that because I inspected this in person back when I was in Poland, where I bought it. And the reason is fairly simple. This metal chape is attached only by glue, and over the past 150 years, it has become very loose. As a result, it is free to move. This happened during transit, and I actually had to fix the chape when it arrived. And as a result, there was significant overhang past the blade. The blade terminated about here when it was out of kilter. As a result, a lot of this chape was hanging over, and when it flexed, it broke at this point. If the chape had been secured by a glue which lasted 150 years, it never would have broken, and this wouldn't have been an issue. But if you were to unsheath your sword and have the scabbard empty, and then perhaps sit on it, or have someone bump into you, there is a chance you would break this scabbard. The upside, of course, is that they're fairly cheap to make, and therefore cheap to replace if you were to break one in period. However, today you have to go to someone like Coulaux sword to have it replaced. As a result, I'm relying on this to simply protect the blade while it's on display and in storage. Due to the very close fit to the leather in the blade, and the nickel-coated finish, I'm not worried about it falling off or damaging the blade, so for my purposes of safe storage, it is perfectly sufficient. I do have to commend the seller, as they did not try to imply that this was an original 16th, 17th, or 18th century rapier. They did say it was 19th century, and that it was made in Klingenthal. Klingenthal was a major blade producer during the 19th century. It has a very long and storied history that I'll attempt to cover in another video. But let me simply say that it was originally a state-owned arsenal in Alsace when it was a French-owned territory, and eventually it became a privately run corporation under the Coulaux brothers, and later their sons. This one was made during the period that they were a corporation rather than simply a pair of brothers. And thus it is marked Coulaux et Cie, or Co, Klingenthal. Klingenthal means Valley of the Blades in German, and it was in French-held Alsace-Lorraine. As a result, you can expect that much later on, this area was retaken, particularly during the World Wars, and was not a French territory. The factory actually maintained operations on some level until around 1962, when it sold off all its tooling. I have a feeling some of it ended up at WKC in Germany, in Solingen, but that's simply off the top of my head, and I haven't got a way to confirm that at this very moment. The symbology on this sword, if it were in an older time period, would have been fairly relevant. The lion's heads, as previously mentioned, are a royalist symbol, and they were very profoundly important in France during the Revolution, and of course during the Restoration eras. A display of royalism during the 1830s and 40s would have simply been harkening back to either family history or trying to harken back to an earlier era. I do not believe this was intended to be a display of allegiance to any particular political party at the time. It's simply a bit of nostalgia in the form of a sword. However, the Medusa head is a bit of revival classicism. Classical revival ideas have been around France for a very long time, and we can see it in the architecture, symbology, and art of the time. There is in fact an author who wrote quite extensively about the use of symbology like Medusa and the Demigorgon in the period. As I mentioned earlier, there's a link in the description if you want to see that. That's all I've got for today. I hope you enjoyed taking a look at this sword. This has been IPO Swords, and we've been looking at a rapier from 1836 to 1847 that has a blade in the scale of a small sword and a slightly undersized hilt. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and if you did, please consider subscribing to my channel, liking the video, and leaving a comment with any questions. I hope that this upgraded second version has fixed all of the issues of the previous version. Until next time, stay sharp.